Welcome to No Free Lunch, Africa's freshest business and tech talk show, where today we'll be talking AI and AI skepticism with a somewhat controversial view about its real value to mankind. And with me on No Free Lunch today, I'm honored to welcome Nick Hudson, the co-founder and chairman of PANDA, that's Pandemics Data and Analytics, who is a vocal critic of artificial intelligence, framing it as a profound example of technological and economic hubris. Nick describes AI as a deliberate and grotesque misallocation of capital on the scale far exceeding even the renewable sector. Welcome, Nick. Welcome to No Free Lunch.
Thank you for having me on, Greg.
Nick, you've called AI the grotesque misallocation of our era. Before we unpack that, let me just ask you, what's one human endeavor you'd redirect those trillions towards if it was in your hands?
I would definitely be spending money on old-fashioned infrastructural capacity. Okay. This is a global phenomenon, particularly in the West. There are some countries in the East that are investing heavily in capacity, notably China, Russia. But the story of South Africa and of many countries in the West is of massively decaying infrastructure. In South Africa, we haven't invested in our water reticulation or in new dams for decades. And on the electricity front, all of the hype around this net zero and the supposed climate crisis, all of that nonsense has driven a misallocation of investment into very expensive power from the mirrors and windmills, the solar photovoltaic cells and the wind turbines. And these are, however you slice it, extremely expensive wherever any country has tried to source any material power from those two categories. There's been a rapid increase in the cost of electricity. And we're already in a situation where our electricity costs have spiked over the last couple of decades from around 15 US cents to $2. You know, that's a massive increase in real terms. And so I would be investing in nuclear, in coal, and experimentally in natural gas, and I'd be trying to do it in as modular a fashion as possible, but certainly not devoting resource investments or infrastructure investments into the renewables. And the same goes for AI. I mean, the story as we receive it, the kind of official narrative, if you like, is there's a certain pace of development in these things called artificial intelligences, and the development shows no sign of abating. At some point in the future, they're going to be more intelligent than human beings, and the phenomenon of artificial general intelligence will have been attained. At some point shortly after that, we face the prospect of a singularity where this AI sort of gets into an escape velocity, and many prognosticators will tell you that at that point we're all in serious danger, and therefore we need to regulate these AGIs and so on. And, before any of that happens, before the singularity, before an artificial general intelligence, the idea is that the advent of these LMs is going to result in a whole lot of jobs becoming redundant, and that swathes of people are going to be displaced from gainful employment with nothing else to do. And I believe that story is almost entirely false from beginning to end. There's no true element to it.
So let's just unpack that a bit. If AI investments mirror renewables' early missteps, let's say, for instance, that are now yielding gains, or the initial investments in the internet development that happened in the late 80s and so on, and in the early 90s. Why dismiss the sector outright rather than advocating targeted allocation to pursue models that avoid centralized bubbles, let's say?
Yeah, so, I mean, the internet era and the so-called third industrial revolution of digitization was a complete nothing. People were saying the same thing, that when computers came around, it was going to result in a lot of automation and there'd be job losses on vast scales, and we needed to do something about it, and this was going to be a disaster and so on. And not only did that not happen, but we did not find that the digitization era actually resulted in measurable productivity improvements at an economy-wide level. What's happened over the course of the last 40, 50 years, during which this supposed third industrial revolution was taking place, is that there's been the exact opposite. We've had a winnowing of the middle class and a very stagnant economic situation where per capita economic growth in the West has been declining towards zero in real terms. And so the third industrial revolution was almost a complete misnomer. And I similarly take issue with this characterization of the AI phenomenon as A, a revolution, and B, a fourth industrial revolution. I don't see nearly the productivity improvements that people are claiming will come about in future. And my reasoning here is not that complex. First of all, I think there's a problem really with referring to these things as AIs in the first place. I've always said that the term is great, except for two things. They're not intelligent and they're not artificial. So I prefer the terminology of real automation. What you've got with these models is some ability at fairly low levels of complexity to automate certain tasks. And we've all done that. We've all gone and played with a ChatGPT or something. And typically in a domain where we don't have deep knowledge, we can get it to summarize information very quickly in a way that does surpass human abilities. The uses for that kind of application are really edge cases. They're nothing threatening. There's always technological development that results in changes in the way things are done, at least under condition of freedom. That's always the case. And so you're on the edges, yes. There's some very tedious tasks are now becoming obsolete, or at least they're being done by these models. And that's fine. That's all good. But the reality that people fail to grapple with, I think, is that the energetic burdens of applying these models to greater degrees of complexity, where, the kind of tasks that most humans are involved with on a day-to-day basis are massive. It's not a simple case of, well, we're just going to use a slightly bigger data center and slightly bigger servers, or just more power being provided there into that infrastructure. The reality is quite different. The power demands of dealing with increasing complexity are a kind of hyper exponential function. And so to make an appreciable degree of progress with respect to the degree of complexity that can be dealt with by these models, you are talking an amount of extra energy that has to be thrown into the problem that we will not see for hundreds of years, perhaps, unless there's some massive step change in economic growth. And so I just don't think people have really understood the implications of the complexity challenge and the degree to which the existing technologies are not able to simply scale up to deal with that complexity.
Do you not think that AI has had some demonstrable delivery in terms of creating new knowledge? Let's talk AlphaFold that generated novel protein structures, for instance. Linked with human interaction, is it not potentially going to create an upside reward for mankind?
I think the scope for it to generate new knowledge is effectively zero. There might be corners of deduction or induction of inference that people haven't thought to explore, and so little pieces on the map of deductive analytics that have not yet been colonized by human minds. But that's not really the creation of new knowledge. In terms of actual novel problem solving, we've never been able to describe how humans do that. We don't have an algorithmic reduction or even a set of interacting algorithms which explains that uniquely human capacity for creative problem solving. And that's the hallmark of general intelligence. I would say even you can drop the word general. It's the hallmark of intelligence. Yes. And as far as we know, only humans possess it. There are no other structures in the observable universe that have ever been shown to have that ability to create new knowledge by creative and solving of novel problems. So I think this aspiration is completely overblown. And the idea that the existing algorithms run on faster computers will suddenly become intelligent, I find it quite laughable. It's like saying, well, imagine if you'd taken Windows 3.1 that used to run on the DOS system, as a graphic user interface on the DOS system, and you put it on a much faster computer. Imagine how much better it would be. Of course, it wouldn't be better. It's the algorithm that has to be improved. And we don't know anything about the algorithm for creative problem solving, which, as I say, is actually the defining characteristic of intelligence altogether. What I observe is a lot of magical thinking. People will do some hand waving and say, it's just a matter of time. And if we throw more energy at these things or faster chips or whatever the case may be, all of a sudden, spontaneously, this thing's going to start solving problems creatively.
Is this whole thing being driven by the investment hype? Is it just an investment type bubble that's taken root and is driving this? How do you see that?
I think there is an aspect that is simply people getting overexcited, which is almost a characteristic of bubbles. But the reason I think for this one being so large and such a massive misallocation is that there's a very strong current in political ideology that says that what we should all be working towards is governance at the global level, supported by artificial intelligence. Probably the most notable proponent of all of that is Tony Blair and his Tony Blair Institute. There are people in South Africa, politicians in South Africa, for example, Helen Zille, who are acolytes and real adherents to this type of philosophy. And so I think what you see is a lot of people who are enamored of this kind of technocratic vision of globally centralized government aided by artificial intelligence are finding themselves aligned with people who are very excited by imagined commercial prospects. And as a result, this bubble is being inflated by the combination of market and political forces.
So in terms of making sense of this whole thing, is this just going to burst, in your perspective, is this just going to burst and create no growth? Or do you think there's there's a lot of corporates that spend a lot of money investing in AI systems and so on. They're insisting that they've seen increase in productivity, better customer service. They've seen improvements in things like customer satisfaction levels, increased sales. Is all of that simply an illusion, or is there some substance to the value of the AI systems?
Yeah, as I say, I'm seeing edge cases of that, really isolated little elements. And for the most part, businessmen that I speak to are not claiming that they're getting any real productivity improvements from the investments they've made to date. In fact, if I challenge people, I say to them, just go and, the people who are meant to be really benefiting from this are the law firms and the accounting firms, because they're dealing with digitized information, so it's easy to apply algorithms to it. And these are the people who should be benefiting. But if you ask them how much their fees are going to come down by this year, they say no, they haven't actually seen cash returns to their investments, so they can't reduce the fees. And that's a very common response. So I'll believe it when my accounting firm comes to me and says that next year my audit fee is going to be 15 or 20% lower because they've managed to apply an AI model and reduce the number of articled clerks working on our audit. Then I'll believe that these actual productivity improvements are really coming through. But in my experience, what happens is an efficiency is created, but there's an inefficiency that pops out somewhere else that has to be remedied. And plus you need somebody to be able to run and deploy these models properly and to prompt them correctly and to put the data in the correct format, to structure the investigation correctly and so on. And that's a new class of work, if you like. So I'm very skeptical. I think a lot of people are getting carried away with themselves, and we are not seeing reductions in prices, which is that should be the result. If you're in a competitive market where there are multiple audit firms and multiple law firms, we would see prices coming down if there were productivity improvements, but we do not.
So I have a last question for you, and it's a small curveball. I went and asked Grok what question he would pose to you, or it would pose to you if Grok was interviewing with you. So I'm going to run with that and see where that takes us. And what Grok said is, Nick, you rightly call out AI's hype as a $1 trillion illusion that crowds out real progress like diverting funds from soil generation or decentralized education. But if tools like me, that is Grok, can sift through mountains of data to spotlight overlooked patterns, say in pandemic policy flaws or economic distortions, faster than any solo human could, and at a fraction of the cost of traditional R&D bureaucracies, aren't we reallocating capital towards your kind of thinking, critical thinking, or do you see even that as polished mimicry doomed to echo chambers rather than breaking new ground?
Well, it's so funny to hear that, because one of my major criticisms is that we are averaging over the aggregate of human output with a human-driven selection of what output is used to train models. Now, I think there's been an incredible amount published especially over recent decades, that is based on very flimsy grounds and basically completely false narratives. The renewable energy category would be one such example. So if you go and average over all the acres of text that have been printed around the question of renewable energy, you will get a lot of false claims being elaborated or adopted by an initial AI position. You can always then go and challenge that and force it to look at dissident texts or whatever. So you're in effect training the model on a different subset of materials and so on, and then it'll give you a different answer. So I don't think that these averaging processes are a very good way of arguing with an intelligent entity at all. Just averaging over what some deliberately criminal or misleading or deluded individuals have said is not a good way to engage with intelligence.
And I think one of the big issues for me is the ongoing issues that have not really been dealt with in terms of AI starting to hallucinate when it doesn't have an answer for something. And this is a regular occurrence where it will just create something. Now, I don't know whether that's an indication of AI's inability to simply deal with the question. It should just say, I don't have the answer. But it is an interesting thing that keeps on reoccurring and is happening on every single AI platform.
Yes. Yeah, what's going on there links back to the point I made at the beginning about complexity. So what's happening is as the problem that you're evaluating increases in complexity, the model begins to decohere. It can't engage with that complexity. And then, so it appears to be hallucinating, but actually what's happening is the model is beginning to fall apart. It cannot parse the logical connections. It can't deal with the fuzziness and apparent paradoxes of real world complexity. And I use that term, deliberately. It's apparent paradoxes. There are no actual paradoxes. We face a unitary reality and every element of it is compatible with every other element. So when you perceive a paradox, it's merely an apparent paradox. But these models, when they encounter this kind of thing, begin to decohere. The gap between where they start to decohere and become entirely useless is very, very thin. And that is actually an almost axiomatic point in the domain of information theory, of epistemology. It predicts both that rising energetic burden that I mentioned and the decoherence and the shape of those trajectories. So one of the real problems here, I might just add here, I think that there probably are some very good epistemologists slaving away inside these AI firms. I would hope so. But the leadership seem not to have touched the basics of the subject. If you're making investment allocation decisions regarding AI models or the infrastructure that they run on, you really need to have studied a lot of complexity theory and epistemology. And when I listen to these AI bosses speaking, I cannot detect a background or training in either of those two domains. And that's very disturbing.
Yes, I agree with you there. And in fact, again, it's a lot is driven by hype and what is the next right thing that's on the horizon. And that does become problematic because it's not necessarily adding value or deepening the ability of the system. So, Nick, final thoughts from you. Where's AI heading to? And I mean, I fully agree on the fact that there could be a much more, shall we say, valuable repositioning of the capital input into AI into things such as infrastructure and so on. But given the fact that we're already so far down this pathway, where are we going to end? Is this thing just going to end in tears? What's your prediction?
Well, in my day job, I run a private equity firm, and so I'm in the business of capital allocation. And we are evaluating allocation of small amounts of capital to those edge cases that I mentioned at the application layer of not into actual LLMs or anything like that. And so I think there are useful allocations of capital that can be made in very selected and careful doses. I don't want to overstate the case, and try and present that there's absolutely no point in pursuing any investigation into AI. That's not what I believe. But it's clear to me that we are running out of infrastructure, and that without it, economic growth will first stall, and then we'll begin to go backwards. And then you're in a world of pain. So to me, we need to develop the pushback against these misallocations of capital, first in the renewable space and then at the political level as well. Because I think before long, we are going to be seeing large state-driven misallocation of capital into AI in the hopes that it will address the question of state incapacity, which is something we're all palpably aware of in South Africa. You just know that the competence and capabilities of the public sector, especially at a national level, have been comprehensively eroded to the point that in many areas the state no longer has any capacity at all. And the temptation will be to attempt to address that by spending money on artificial intelligence. If you've got no human intelligence left in the department, then let's try artificial intelligence. And I think that'll be terrible misallocation, and there will be all sorts of corruption around it and so on.
Yeah, no doubt. Nick Hudson, it's been fascinating talking to you, and I hope you and I can maybe have a couple of more interesting conversations down the road. I want to thank you for giving us some of your time. I know you're pressed for time today. And thank you for your insights. Much appreciated.
Thanks very much, Greg, and thank you to your listeners.